There we go. Hello and welcome, everyone. Hopefully, people will continue straggling in because we have about half the people we normally have. Um, the Today we're going to be talking about the global war on terror. But before we get to that, um, just wanted to reiterate what the format is going to be for this final week. Hopefully, I can get through this lecture in just the today, and then we will have the typical cat hairs all over the place. There that we'll have the normal discussion and all that kind of stuff, but on Thursday we're going to have a study session to help prepare you for the final. The final will be available from this Friday to the next. And also in the same time period, you'll need to turn in your reading journal. So um, that'll be the second half of your reading journal. You've already turned in the first half. Um, and that um, We'll be discussing all of that stuff on Thursday. So as soon as I can see without cat hairs getting on my glasses, um, let's hop right into the lecture. There we go. So, last time we talked about the basically bringing this class all the way up to present and talking about how American politics kind of turned inwards after the fall of the Soviet Union. But um, at the same time, we sought a new adversary. And that adversary, especially after 2001, was quite apparently terrorism abroad. Um, and throughout all of this, we're going to see that the United States essentially became the world's hegemonic power, and with the ability to basically police other states. Um, and this was, part of a long rise in terrorism. And when we're talking about terrorism here, we are talking about international terrorism. Thank you. There we go. So there's many types of terrorism, but typically what we refer to as terrorism is international terrorism, um, as in people moving across borders to do that. There's domestic terrorism, of course, but and there's also state-sponsored terrorism. Um, so most of what we're talking about today is international terrorism. The names kind of um, speak for themselves. You have um, terror groups that are not states, so they're not state sponsored. Um, and then you have everything in between. But mostly, we're going to be focusing on the origins of Al Qaeda here, um, because the U.S. actually has a long amount of involvement in the Middle East. Um, so we'll see if we can actually get through this lecture in one day. Um, the uh, the U.S. Really became involved in Middle East in a number of ways um, after World War One, especially with Woodrow Wilson giving creating what was called the mandate system. Even though the United States did not actually enter into the League of Nations in that, um, that was essentially a creation of Woodrow Wilson's. And the great powers split up the Middle East, that was formerly the Ottoman Empire, um, into into their constituent states. Now, it's not like they actually drew random lines. That tends to be a bit of a myth. Um, Most of those lines were drawn by the Ottoman Empire. They were just splitting them up, what were previously just random jurisdictions within an empire were now their own individual countries. One of those being Palestine, and this was under the British Mandate. And so essentially, under the Mandate system, the British were supposed to act as a benevolent power that oversaw their transition to liberty. Um, but really, this was just kind of an extension of empire. Um, while the Palestinian state certainly had um, their own government, the British really controlled them. And throughout the 1920s and 30s, there was a growing movement to called Zionism that Jews abroad would migrate to Palestine and populate the Holy Land. But with World War II and the Holocaust, this supercharged this Zionist movement. And even though in 1940 the British actually stated no more immigration, especially Jewish immigration, they actually legally halted it to Palestine in 1940. This didn't stop the flow, especially because of the Holocaust and the various pogroms that came with the communist taking over of the Eastern Bloc and Jews trying to come back to their homes and facing pogroms there too. So there was a huge exodus from Poland, especially. And this started a conflict that eventually arose with a two-state solution, as the UN called it, as Jews and Palestinians, Jews and Arabs in Palestine started basically having a civil war. Um, the and Jews participating in a huge amount of terrorism at this point to kind of propagate their to declare their own independence. The UN declared that there should be two separate states, a Palestine and an Israel. But as you guys have heard many a time in the news, this has not exactly gone so well. The neighboring Arab states initially tried to invade on behalf of Palestine to prevent the creation of Israel. And Israel, basically on their own, managed to fight off what was called the Arab League. And for years, this Arab League, which was made up of initially of Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. There's a sixth one, probably the UAE or Qatar. But especially all of those countries neighbor Israel. So there were a series of fights, 1948, 1967, 1972, between these states, and territory morphed throughout this time. For instance, after 1948, what was called the Green Zone, which is now the Palestinian state, was actually occupied by Lebanon and Egypt. I mean, Jordan and Egypt. So this green zone basically forms the border today, though it morphed with various intifadas and that in the the 1980s and early 2000s. And the and it Israel's basically been invading on a regular basis, covertly. Um, but you can see there's a ton of conflict on this. But part of what made the U.S. get involved was the involvement of the USSR. Um, in a way, you can actually say that the global war on terror is an afterthought of the Cold War, because the U.S. Sided with Israel, um, initially kind of haphazardly in 1967, but fully in 1972, um, because many of the Arab League were very openly aligned with um, the USSR. So this basically became this Arab-Israel conflict became um, a proxy war between the U.S. and the USSR. Um, but that got resolved in 1978 with the Camp David Accords. You might remember the Camp David Accords from our Crisis of Confidence lecture. But the um, the conflict was resolved only by basically throwing all of the Arab League under the bus. Um, Egypt and Israel came to an accord at Camp David with President Carter officiating the proceedings and everything. And Egypt got back the Sinai Peninsula, a place that Israel had been occupying since the 72 war. And the Israel swore that they'd eventually get out of the West Bank and Gaza, but they kind of didn't actually. Kind of reneged on that. But um, what Israel got out of this was recognition from Egypt and full diplomatic ties, which, you know, none of the Arab League was willing to recognize Israel. And so a lot of animosity came from this. And you start seeing a lot of terrorist groups starting to target Americans, especially in Lebanon, because they've been in the middle of a civil war for a while there. And which started up again in 1980, just a couple years after these Camp David Accords. And so people who were pissed off with Americans started kidnapping Americans abroad and ransoming them. This is actually what led to the Iran-Contra affair, was trying to negotiate with these terrorists over ransoming for American hostages. Hello. We have a visitor. Hello, King. But this was simmering tensions and got really blown out of the water with the Iranian Revolution in 1979. Iran had been under a well, the Iranian Revolution is complicated, but then we don't really need to go into all the different pieces of it. But as they came to power, they started openly supporting groups like the Palestinian Liberation Organization and the various terrorist organizations that were affiliated with it. And they even helped create another terrorist organization called Hezbollah. Um, and so the Iranian Revolution was the rise of radical Islamists um, as an actual state. Nowhere in the Middle East had been a radical um, Islamic state. Um, so this was supercharging all of that right as the Lebanese civil war was going on, and so Hezbollah and PLO affiliates um, were right at the head of all of this terrorism that kind of came with the Lebanese civil war. And so in 1982, the U.S. actually joined a peacekeeping mission to try to stop Lebanon, to kind of hold the lines where they were, especially as Israel started trying to get involved in the Lebanese civil war. Um, and then right in the middle of this intervention, in 1983, a Marine barracks was bombed in Beirut, um, leading to 307 Marines, and others being killed. Less than a year later, the U.S. pulled out of this coalition to try to tamp down this Lebanese civil war. So in a way, um, the terrorists got their way. Um, this was a peacekeeping mission, and them getting attacked like that was seen as the reason for the U.S. leaving. The actual reason was more Reagan didn't want to spend money on it. Didn't see it as a successful mission and just wanted to pull out. But that's not the image that the terrorists came up with. So this entire this entire group of terrorism was really growing in the Middle East. And then you had the rise throughout this period of radical Islam in Egypt. There had been this Muslim Brotherhood that started in 1928, which was more about fighting foreign influence in Egypt at first, but there were a series of like more radical thinkers that were part of the Brotherhood. For instance, in the 1960s, there was this guy named Saeed Qutb, and Qutb basically theorized that terrorism is the only way to get things done, right? And this he was executed for plotting the assassination of Egypt's president at the time, but his ideas lingered. Qutbism is kind of the foundation of Al-Qaeda. But because because of the Camp David Accord, Egyptian radicals were kind of the main force behind a lot of this terrorism, the actual people being radicalized to do this stuff, especially suicide bombers. Though Egypt would eventually crack down on them, this is where the ideology formed of Al-Qaeda. But Al-Qaeda was not actually formed in the Middle East. It was formed in Afghanistan. Afghanistan, by the way, is not the Middle East. It is Central Asia. But this was because during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, a group called the Mujahideen fought against the Soviets, and this Mujahideen had a lot of support. We talked about this in the Reagan lecture. had a lot of support from the U.S., but the U.S. was funneling these funds through Pakistan and really didn't have any control over where they were going. And one of the Saudi financiers that was sent to Pakistan to kind of be a global financier was this guy named Osama bin Laden. So bin Laden was not exactly part of the Mujahideen. It was more of a financier than an actual Mahid, but the this was how he started forming a network, was through his connections during the Mujahideen period of the Afghan Civil War. And right as the Russians started pulling out, he formed his own radical group of Islamists modeled off of Hezbollah and the radical Islamists in Egypt, and that called Al Qaeda. So from basically as soon as the Soviets pulled out, the communist government in Afghanistan started to collapse. It didn't really have much control outside of what's called the Ring Road in Afghanistan, which is actually, funnily enough, is basically the only parts that we control in Afghanistan today. This was an incredibly weak position, and all the Mujahideen managed to defeat them in 1992. But by this point, Al Qaeda had already moved to, initially tried to move to Egypt, but that didn't work out so well because Egypt started cracking down, and so they had to go to Sudan, just south of Egypt. So while Osama bin Laden is in Sudan, he starts trying to get people to fight Saddam Hussein, who had just recently invaded Kuwait. So he offers his services to his home country, Saudi Arabia. But Saudi Arabia, the Sauds, the ruling monarchs, decide to go with an international coalition to push out, well, initially to possibly defend against Saddam invading Saudi Arabia, and then to push Saddam out of Kuwait. And that coalition was led by the United States. This is the Persian Gulf War. And this absolutely pisses off Osama bin Laden. He starts thinking that that this is a desecration of the Holy Land because Saudi Arabia is, where Mecca is, the most holy of lands for Islam. And so he started kind of building up this conspiracy theory that the United States was trying to destroy Islam itself. And he would constantly talk about how the U.S. was engaging in this war on Islam. Now it's a conspiracy theory, but this is really what pushed Al Qaeda to focus on the United States rather than other Muslims like it had up until that point. Al Qaeda had already been committing some atrocities in terms of it committed a couple of massacres in Pakistan, hence why Osama bin Laden had to move from Pakistan to Saudi Arabia and then to Sudan. But with the Persian Gulf War, now Osama bin Laden thinks that the U.S. is out to attack Islam, and so he starts planning all of these terror attacks in response. So, um, his first attack, his first terror attack was on the Aden Hotel in the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, um, was killing 6. Um, it was supposed to attack U.S. Marines who happened to be staying there for literally a night, um, but he didn't actually kill any of them. He did manage to kill one American, but most of the people he killed were not Americans. Um, but a um, semi-related, it's not actually Al Qaeda that did this, but the guy who had close connections to Al Qaeda planned a bombing of the World Trade Center in New York, um, which blew up the garage underneath, killing 6. Um, Now, it's not actually Al Qaeda. Like, Al Qaeda officially disavowed it, but it was, many of the perpetrators were very much connected to the Al Qaeda network. Um, he planned a few car bombings throughout the 90s, and in particular, what landed him on America's radar was in 1998. He sent a he sent a car bomb into the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi, Kenya, which you can see pictured here is the aftermath of that, and it killed 224, um, mostly Americans, but 224 people. Um, and so this landed Osama bin Laden on the FBI's most wanted list in 1998, and the U.S. started trying to go after him in a number of ways. For instance, we managed to convince Saddam to expel him from the country, and so he had to go to Afghanistan again, the place that he knew that he could keep um, keep with keep safe and maybe help the newly arose Taliban. Taliban in Pashtun literally just means students, and it was a group of students and a mujahideen um, teacher who kind of led this radical Islamist um, fight to get rid of all the warlords um, who were running Afghanistan after the collapse of the communist government. They'd been fighting a civil war amongst themselves, and then the Taliban kind of sweeps up, especially when they start using these Toyota trucks with machine guns on the back. These Toyota Hiluxes became kind of the calling card of the Taliban. And they managed to really push the the other mujahideen who had become warlords in that up into the north of the country. So there was this Northern Alliance fighting against the Taliban in general. And Osama bin Laden comes in, sees the Taliban being, radical Islamists and everything, and allies with them to basically make Al Qaeda kind of shock troops for the Taliban, which has a huge effect. Really pushes the Northern Alliance right into the fringes, to the point that on in they managed to assassinate the leader of the Northern Alliance, this guy who was known as the Lion of the North. So that seemed like they were about to win the war and everything, but Al Qaeda had continued pushing for terrorism. They attacked the USS Cole, for instance, in 2000. So, like, he's still managing to keep this terror network up, even while fighting a war in Afghanistan. And literally 3 days after after they managed to assassinate this Lion in the North guy, that was on September 9th, 2011. And then Al-Qaeda had their biggest success they would ever have 3 days later. So 9/11, September 11th, 2001, came just a few days after it seemed like the Taliban would be able to consolidate Afghanistan under their control. So them attacking, them being affiliated with somebody who was attacking the United States seems like a really bad idea in hindsight. And so in that morning, four planes were hijacked. Americans at this point were actually fairly used to dealing with plane hijackings. They were not uncommon, but typically when a plane would get hijacked, it would be for ransom. So when they started flying these planes into buildings, it was a rather sudden change of how plane hijackings had been up until that point. So that's why like passengers didn't really fight back for the first 3 planes, but cell phones existed at this point, and so one of the planes was taken down by the passengers out in Pennsylvania, but 2 of the planes successfully hit the World Trade Centers, the 2 tallest towers in America. They also hit the Pentagon. That other plane that landed in Pennsylvania was actually targeted for Congress, by the way. It was meant to hit the Capitol building. So just think what could have happened if the passengers didn't fight back. Rescue workers come in, try to get people out of the towers that are burning and everything, but the steel of the buildings gets superheated and actually starts to bend, which brought down the 2 towers with a bunch of people in it. These attacks killed about 3,000 Americans overall. So 9/11 is a day that is burned into the memory of everyone who can remember it, who were old enough. I know some of you might have actually been born after 9/11, so some of you might not remember it, but it's quite an emotional thing. And the United States reacted swiftly. Congress passed a resolution to basically give President Bush a blank check to do whatever he needed to do to end this terrorist threat. At first, nobody knew who had committed this act of terror, and then it became quite clear that it was Osama bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda network. And so the U.S. gave an ultimatum to Afghanistan: surrender Osama bin Laden or face the consequences. They refused. Basically, they actually said that they would surrender him to Pakistan and have him tried in a Sharia court, but that was not enough for a very, very angry nation. And so the U.S. decided to defend ourselves by invading Afghanistan. And as we've already talked about, this was more of an intervention than trying to completely take over the country. We sided with the Northern Alliance, and the U.S. had already been supporting the Northern Alliance as part of part of this kind of fight against Osama bin Laden prior to 9/11. But in October of 2001, we sent in actual troops. Um, the U.S. intervention managed to really, it's startlingly successful. At first, the very few troops were sent in, mostly special forces, to help with the Northern Alliance so that they could drop drop bombs more accurately. The U.S. had a bunch of B-52s flying around and dropping bombs, and so that little amount of help was enough to completely swing the war in the Northern Alliance's favor. They took over the country. That is, the current government is made up of what was the Northern Alliance. So this was the initial U.S. intervention into Afghanistan. Like by December of 2001, we had defeated the Taliban. Hadn't found Osama bin Laden. Turned out that he had fled to Pakistan. But we would remain there, and actually kind of remain there today, 20 years later. But now the focus became trying to keep the country stable, because Afghanistan had essentially been in a civil war since 1978, since the Sahar coup of 1978. So there's this long history of violence there. And, the Soviets invaded in 1979. Then the Civil War broke out. The Taliban rose up in the middle of the Civil War and supported Al-Qaeda. So this is a country that's been fighting a war for 30 years at this point, right? And now it's been 50. They've had half a century of continuous warfare. So trying to build up the country at what's called nation building became the chief goal of the United States in Afghanistan. So we started engaging in what were called hearts and minds. We created these things called provincial reconstruction teams, and essentially the PRTs go around building up roads and installing power stations, making hospitals and stuff like that. And the idea is that by the U.S. financing and helping create these things, helping build the nation, that it will warm the hearts and minds of Afghans. You can see pictured here is this is actually my own picture from my own turret, and I was there to defend the provincial reconstruction teams as what's called security forces, Sec 4 for the PRT. And the whole point of these things is that, like, this picture right here is that we were surveying this road right here. We had this makeshift little get together right here that ended up getting mortared, but we were surveying this road to pave it. So that was the essential mission of the PRTs. In 2009, there was a big surge that started in 2009, but really picked up in 2010. And this was seen as kind of a success. The country had a rise in violence, and then it kind of went away. So by 2014, the U.S. Decided to hand off control of the war to Afghanistan, but changing to what's called Operation Resolute Support. And Operation Resolute Support is different from the original Operation Enduring Freedom, which was the army name for the Afghanistan war. OEF was um, U.S. control of the war. Now it is Afghanistan. We're kind of doing what you might remember Vietnamization. We're kind of doing that right now with Afghanistan. Um, but thus far, there actually haven't been that significant of casualties. The total number of U.S. casualties as of 2020 um, is 2,500 dead Americans and around 70,000 allies who have died. More than 75,000 enemy have been killed, and there's been around 40,000 dead civilians. Realize Afghanistan's a country the size of Texas, so this is kind of a low intensity war. But because it's so long that it's hard to keep up this kind of support, to the point that we've been there since even having found Osama bin Laden in Pakistan and taken him out in 2011. I actually got a copy of this lecture when I was initially setting it up. Was written before that. So a lot of this stuff. Wait, hold on. A lot of this stuff turned inwards. It a lot of trying to focus on, since Afghanistan is such a low level war. The U.S. tried to focus on terrorism elsewhere. For instance, there would be actually there still is OEF Horn of Africa. So we have troops in Africa throughout the Sahel region. We had troops in the Philippines, a couple of other Central Asia countries. You could tell it's a Central Asian country if it has Stan in the name. But we had a lot of spread on this kind of stuff, and it was not enough to soothe the anger of the American nation. And so we started practicing, and we started really trying to fight terrorism through secret means. For instance, in late September through early October of right after the attacks, there had been a series of anthrax attacks that people put weaponized anthrax in letters and mailed them to government officials. Only one person died from these attacks because of, and this was a mail handler. Then in December of 2001, there was a shoe bomber who tried to blow up a plane by putting Simtax in his shoes. So this was, there was real fear about more attacks coming. And what didn't help matters is the attacks also sent the U.S. into an economic shock. The stock market immediately crashed. It was closed as soon as the 9/11 attacks started. The following week or so, it just crashed. There were also about $40 billion in terms of insurance claims due to all this, and it came right on top of the dot-com bubble having burst the previous year. So economically, the U.S. was not doing well, and one of the biggest predictors of American attitudes is just the economy. And so this worsened the effect of the attacks in terms of the nation's fear and anger. And so people started resorting to attacking anyone who was of Middle Eastern race, especially Arabs, or really anyone who practiced Islam in the United States. Um, now, um, this uh, resulted in a bunch of hate crimes throughout the United States. Um, Vandalism of mosques became quite prevalent, and people really fearmonger even today about the dangers of Islam because of this fear and anger from 9/11. Um, on top of all this, in um, right after the attacks, there was a 2-day ban on air travel whatsoever across the entire United States. 2 days of no commercial flights. Basically, only the military was allowed to fly. Um, and very quickly, airports started kind of creating their own security to stop possible more hijackers. That's how the shoe bomber was caught. Um, the uh, the um, but these were fairly haphazard and didn't follow any kind of particular protocol until the creation of the Transportation Security Administration in November of 2001. So you can see there's this kind of security apparatus quickly being built right after 9/11. Um, the TSA eventually would be subsumed under a new creation in November of 2002 called the Department of Homeland Security. And Homeland Security has control over federal police, uh, customs, border patrol, and immigration services. So it kind of consolidated these disparate agencies and brought them together under one department, consolidated power, all for the sake of security. Um, the but the U.S. was resorting to, well, what even then was called extreme measures. The U.S. for a few years was quite reminiscent of the Red Scare, where there was constant fear mongering um, about this terrorist threat. In October of 2001, the what's simply called the Patriot Act, but the long version, I'm going to have to read it out. It's an annoying acronym, but uniting and strengthening America by providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism act was passed. So, the U.S. had just barely started the invasion of Afghanistan, and we created this Patriot Act. And what it basically allowed was the U.S. government to have almost unlimited spying capability, especially domestic spying capability, so long as it was related to terror. If they could prove it in these FICA courts, these federal courts, that it was related to terror. Interestingly enough, the Patriot Act's arguably unconstitutional surveillance clause was not renewed last year. So apparently the government doesn't have that power anymore. We'll see if that actually has any change, but supposedly that particular part of the Patriot Act is no more. the U.S. also started engaging in what we call extraordinary rendition, and basically it's either people who get picked up in war or people who are possibly terrorists will be kidnapped by by American agents and taken to well, there's more sites than just Guantanamo, but specifically Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, where the U.S. has this hazy sovereignty over. And because of that hazy sovereignty, the U.S. argues that it's not American soil, and therefore we're not engaging in kidnapping because they're not on American soil. It's a legalistic argument for Americans to be allowed to kidnap people. And at its height, it had almost 800 prisoners. I might have actually sent somebody there while I was in Afghanistan, in fact. The 9 have died in custody, and this has led to a huge amount of backlash because the conditions there are abhorrent. You can see here them being basically tortured. What this is, you can see that they have goggles on, they're wearing masks so that they're can't smell anything or have any kind of sense of their surroundings. Their gloves are taped, and they're wearing soundproof ear things, whatever that's called. And this form of what's called enhanced interrogation is what really got Americans pissed off about what's been going on in Guantanamo and elsewhere. This, in particular, one of these enhanced interrogation methods or torture is what is called waterboarding. And essentially all they do is they put you on a board, tilt you backwards, put a washcloth over your face, and start pouring water on it. Because of the water in the washcloth dampening your entire over your nose and mouth, you start having a sensation of drowning. This is somewhat like the water method back in the Philippines, if you remember that lecture. There was also, this sensory deprivation that's being depicted here, humiliation also depicted here, where, they're being humiliated into this, although they'd also have people pray while like this, that they were, the U.S. would allow them to pray, which in Islam you're supposed to do 5 times a day and face Mecca. Obviously, if this is a prayer session being administered here, they can't all be facing Mecca. But with your senses deprived, you don't know which way you're facing anyways. There'd also be sexual humiliation, as in people would be deprived of clothing and made to walk around naked and all that kind of stuff. And this began quite quickly. In August of 2002, a series of memos known as the torture memos were signed off, and in the Bush administration, basically allowing for these enhanced interrogation methods. And those memos leaked in 2004, leading to a huge outcry, and we got to watch the vice president um, continually try to um, defend torture. Um, and that, and also, on top of all of these extreme measures, the Patriot Act allowed for domestic spying in a way that we haven't seen since World War One. Um, the NSA engaged in warrantless surveillance um, from 2001 to 2007. This really um, the Patriot Act allowed things like groups like the FBI to engage in a whole bunch of um, kind of warrantless searches, but through the FICA court, it's technically warranted. And the NSA even started trying to use what's called a dragnet method, that on the internet, that they would use these massive servers to collect all the data going through government servers, which, by the way, a lot of the internet goes through government servers. And or they'd have it go through like Google servers and send that data to NSA servers called Prism. And this dragnet approach, taking all the data they possibly could, is a clear violation of the First and Fourth Amendment. But this was a point where the U.S. was willing to just forget the Constitution. In 2013, Edward Snowden famously disclosed a lot of these things, but drove doubt in his approach by leaving the country for Russia, where he remains today. But that exposure really damaged the NSA's position in terms of this dragnet method, which supposedly they are not doing anymore. There's kind of an open question when they say that they're not engaging in this behavior, whether or not they will continue. So, as you can see, the fear and anger of after 9/11 led to a series of just terrible stuff and the consolidation of power. But the U.S. was not satisfied with Afghanistan alone, and another enemy nation made that was able to refocus that anger, and that country was Iraq. The U.S. had actually supported Iraq in the 1980s as they fought against Iran, but after Saddam committed genocide in 1988, the U.S. cut all ties and all that kind of stuff with Iraq, and imposed sanctions. But that wasn't enough to really stop Saddam. Hold on a second. So, as we've already talked about, Saddam ended up invading Kuwait. The U.S. pushed him back in merely 100 hours, and supported uprisings in Iraq. At the same time, the U.S. also imposed a no-fly zone on the northern and southern portions of Iraq, shooting down any Iraqi bombers, any Iraqi fighters or planes that would go over there. Now, this actually resulted in a number of American sorties over Iraq to kind of keep this to keep him from um, possibly engaging in genocide in the north or south, where there were Kurds and Sunnis. Um, and the so the U.S. ended up dropping around 18,000 bombs during this time, during this no-fly period, um, which killed around 1,400 civilians. And Bill Clinton, who was president at the time, would periodically lob cruise missiles into Iraq if every time Iraq menaced the border. And in fact, the U.S. engaged in a small operation in Iraq in 1993 through 94. But none of this really resulted in anything. Throughout this period, while the U.S. was engaged in a very low-level conflict with Iraq, the U.S. was also sponsoring a UN mandate for Saddam to start removing weapons of mass destruction. He had used gas attacks in the Amphoe genocide in 1988, and the UN had imposed massive sanctions on him and everything, and required him to show that he was getting rid of these WMDs by having weapons inspectors come in. But in 1999, the UN actually certified that that probably most of the weapons were gone, but they continued to require inspections. But because of that certification, Saddam used it as a reason to start blocking them from being allowed to see certain facilities. This gave a bunch of suspicion about whether or not he actually had gotten rid of all the WMDs, or if he was making more. And so right after 9/11, while there's all this fear and anger about radical Islam and all that kind of stuff, people start associating radical Islam with anything Middle Eastern, even though the Baathists, the party that Saddam belonged to, were actually kind of secularists. They weren't really concerned about religious mandates or anything like that. But the climate of fear and anger made it so that the Bush administration now could basically fearmonger about these WMDs. They basically the Bush administration basically campaigned against trusting Saddam and really used his blocking of weapons inspectors as a way of building up this fear that he might have WMDs. In October of 2002, just a year after 9/11, Congress passed a resolution saying that if Iraq doesn't shape up, that that the U.S. will invade. And so over the course of the next 6 months, the case was made over and over and over again that Saddam wasn't shaping up. Now, there's a lot, as you can tell, there's a lot of debate as to whether or not he actually had been, trying to conceal something, or, if it was just him, if it was just Saddam being a weirdo dictator. Either way, in 2003, the U.S. invaded Iraq. Now, the UN never actually condoned the invasion, but NATO generally participated in it. Um, it started off with a major campaign called Shock and Awe that basically the U.S. just bombed the crud out of um, the capital, and then in March of 2003 was the initial invasion. Um, it took only 2 months to conquer the entire country, and in December of 2003, Saddam was captured. So you can see these are actually like very swift victories. Um, but just like with Afghanistan, the real problem comes afterward as we occupied the country. Um, the following year, Al Qaeda actually started openly joining the fight against American occupation of Iraq. Um, the there was a significant amount of opposition to Americans staying in the country. While many people were happy that Saddam was overthrown, um, after all, they would execute him. Um, and you can see here, this is a statue of Saddam being torn down by an American tank. Um, the um, this was not enough to make them like our occupation. And so this quickly turned into a quagmire where the US was fighting a war there for from 2003 all the way to 2010. And we'll get to um, arguably the second Iraq War. Um, but the there's a series of fights, internal fights over basically ethnic warfare. There was also a big civil war as some people actually declared independence in that, and that was put down. Um, and especially into the year after the invasion, a lot of public opinion started turning around as the U.S. started using what are called private military contractors, PMCs, or for short, they're really just mercenaries. And these mercenaries, groups like Blackwater, were initially just there to protect American agents, but they overstepped their bounds, especially in 2004, where they engaged in a very public massacre, um, just shooting into a crowd. Um, so public opinion really turned against American occupation because of that. And so eventually the US decided to do the same thing that we were doing in Afghanistan by imposing provincial reconstruction teams to try to to do some nation building in that. In 2007, the US employed a surge just like in Afghanistan, except for this was the first surge. And the US basically sent in an extra 50,000 troops. Iraq had a heck of a lot more soldiers than Afghanistan ever has in it, and it was a major war for a while. But the surge did its job, and eventually the U.S. kind of started withdrawing from 2008 onward. We officially fully withdrew in on December 18th of 2011, but also the U.S. had declared that that the war was over in 2010. Though there would be around 40,000 Marines left as embassy guards in Baghdad. Without the U.S. there, an insurgency built up again, especially a new group of terrorists known as the Islamic State. ISIS really came to power. They were a breakoff from Al Qaeda, but they came up with this idea that they would create a new caliphate. The last caliphate was the Ottoman Empire. So they basically wanted to create a new empire of Islam. And they ended up actually mostly going into Syria, that was having its own civil war. But because they started sponsoring international terrorism in that, the US became involved in that. From They've been mostly defeated by US intervention from 2017 to 2019, but there are small pockets of resistance left even today. So we periodically are invading places like Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon over and over and over again because of groups like ISIS. So this war on terror is still ongoing. And the US has really started to impose our will on other countries purely for, not complying with weapons inspectors and things like that. You know, we in we invaded we've invaded Qatar. We've invaded the bunch of countries in Africa, and that most of these have been very small efforts, but the US continually plays this game of stamping out terrorism wherever it might grow. But we only have a couple minutes left, and that's the just managed to get through the lecture. So hold on a second. Stop the share. There we go. So with all of this being said, with this huge amount of U.S. intervention, the horrors of Guantanamo and that kind of stuff, you can see the U.S. is kind of repeating a lot of the same mistakes that we made with things like Vietnam, the Philippines, the Indian Wars. This is something that is going to continue, even though just recently, for instance, Biden said that he would completely withdraw troops from Afghanistan, though he did actually make that same promise in 2014. In 2012 about 2014, but instead that wasn't the U.S. withdrawing; it was the U.S. handing control over to of the war over to Afghanistan. So as we saw also with like the withdrawal from Iraq, that meant that there were still 40,000 Marines in Iraq, even though we had withdrawn. And groups like ISIS and that keep on coming up over and over and over again. We're basically stomping on snakes. So the I would normally impose this as a question, but we don't really have enough time to go to talk about it. But think about how this has affected your life, how this has changed the way you live. Some of you have only been alive during the war on terror, and yet you can think of like mass surveillance, Islamophobia, U.S. interventionism getting this supercharge, the fear and anger about. For instance, we had a president who kept on trying to label Antifa a terrorist organization for a while. That's obviously rhetoric built upon all this fear and anger and all that kind of stuff. It's something that affects your life to this day, and it is kind of the driving narrative of what the U.S. has been in the 21st century. So that's it. for all the lectures. Be sure to come in tomorrow not tomorrow, Thursday for a study session. With that being said, if there are any questions, you can ask them, but otherwise, have a nice day, everyone.
Thank you.
So I won't be able to make it Thursday because I have to